It is my belief, hopefully uncontroversial, that stories are persuasive entities. Whenever they tell us a character possesses a certain personality, or that a location exudes a kind of atmosphere, or when a moral is spelled out at the end, they are trying to make an argument to us, the participants viewing the story. It is in this context that I've always interpreted the classic mantra, show don't tell. Showing is the evidence, while telling is the conclusion. There's nothing wrong with telling per se, character X is rude, but if it's not supported with evidence at some point, character X never says anything rude, why should we believe what the story is saying? More to the point, with no concrete examples to show, how am I supposed to feel the emotional truth behind the statement? A story which only tells isn't satisfying because it's unpersuasive. We can't follow the story's logic to see how it arrived at the conclusion. So to continue, we're forced to intellectualize the conclusion rather than feel the weight of it firsthand. Gates to Infinity is not the most subtle of games. I think it would be better if it were, but that's a video for a different day. What this lack of subtlety does allow for, though, is the creation of a very explicit paper trail for its arguments. Gates is nothing if not intentional in its choice of subplots. Characters like Girder or Virizion or the Poniard brothers or Muna's gang are not randomly deployed to impede the player. They are specific pieces of evidence the game is laying out to prove the conclusion that the Pokémon world has grown cold. So when Kirim tells us this later on, we aren't scratching our heads wondering what he's talking about. We've seen it for ourselves. But that's only one of many arguments Gates has set out to prove. The bitter cold, too, is hardly a random force of nature for us to contend with. As I tried to argue in my video, the very nature of the bitter cold seeks to intersect with the game's argument on negativity and self-fulfilling prophecies. Gates wants to say that the belief the world is unsalvageable will create the exact conditions which cause it to be unsalvageable. Thus, it is very important to Gates that the people's negativity about the world is the inciting incident which creates the bitter cold, rather than the bitter cold itself causing the people's negativity. This isn't me playing with words here. This fine distinction is the argument. If the story played the bitter cold in the latter way, where it was some eldritch abomination that was born from the ancient depths, independent from the people's behavior, the story could no longer use the bitter cold as evidence for the claim that negativity is corrosive to the world. The story would lose its argumentative power, and the bitter cold would be reduced to a point of diegetic lore. Gates' intentional usage of its subplots and villains to further its argument is a perfect example of what I'm now calling the evil snowflake principle. The idea that the characters in your story, and the events which happen therein, should clearly relate to and facilitate the persuasive goals of the text. Why do I care so much about the evil snowflake principle? Well, it's because of what I was talking about moments ago. Effective persuasion is the key to anchoring the emotions of a story. And if we care at all about crafting something that will invigorate and excite people, it will behoove us to see the various elements within our stories as tools to make them as persuasive as possible. But what I've increasingly noticed in my years of playing video games is that good use of persuasive techniques is hardly a guarantee. I tend to critique games when they fail the evil snowflake principle a lot. Mario and Luigi Brothership was one such example. That game wanted to argue to us about how solitude in the digital age often constitutes a form of selfishness. But the Gloam was an ill-fitting tool for making this argument because it didn't ask our characters to engage with the topic. Whereas Gates used the bitter cold as an indictment of the character's behavior, Brothership has nothing to say about how the Gloam relates to its characters for the first 40 hours. The story doesn't have to consider why connections are important, or why solitude is bad, because the only place where those sentiments are challenged are when the characters accidentally snort too many antisocial particles. None of what the characters say in this state should be taken at face value, the game argues, because they're not in their right state of mind. This is effectively Brothership engaging in an ad hominem to avoid considering the possibility that someone might choose not to be connected to someone for a legitimate reason. Thus, it's hard to read the Gloam as a metaphorical critique of the Concordians because the game does not utilize the Concordians to further its persuasive goals, again until the last 5 hours. A more clever story, on the other hand, would use the Gloam as a dramatic enhancement. The infected characters would be staking out exaggerated positions of their actually held beliefs, rather than spouting new beliefs induced by an outside force. It is this fine distinction which causes Brothership to fail the evil snowflake principle for most of its runtime. Funnily enough, Pokémon Super Mystery Dungeon also fails the principle, despite copying a lot of Gates' homework. In hindsight, while I called Super's final act a retread of Gates, replaying the two games closer together, I now see that Super was actually doing something far more interesting than I gave it credit for. Super is trying to differentiate itself by providing a counter-argument to Gates. While the bitter cold and dark matter are both born from Pokemon's negativity, the solution to each is the other's opposite. The bitter cold must be destroyed, while dark matter must be accepted. This is in line with the partner's assertion that dark matter is simply a part of all Pokemon. Crushing and silencing that negative part of ourselves is destructive and impossible. If the Pokemon in Gates were pervasively negative, Super wants to argue against the other end of the spectrum, against a toxic positivity. Super suggests that self-fulfilling prophecies only go so far. If thoughts and feelings shape our world, if we all pretend our problems don't exist, if the negative parts of us don't exist, then by Gates' logic, they won't, right? Only Super copies a little too many of Gates' notes. The partners in both games are positioned in the story the same way, as aspirational figures whom the other characters should seek to emulate. The partner in Gates is criticized by other characters for being too idealistic. The partner in Super is criticized by other characters for having dreams that outmatch their capabilities. This worked in Gates because the partner was intentionally and effectively contrasted by the setting around him, acting as the single flame that would spark change around the world. But there's a sense in which this is the wrong kind of character archetype for Super. The partner in this story needs to be the one to learn a lesson, not unlike the partner seen in Explorers of Sky. It's easy to see where such a lesson could be applied. Mew is presented as very childish, even airheaded. Similarly, the partner we see for most of the game is impulsive and occasionally inconsiderate. Perhaps this glib attitude, someone who is too unserious about the problems in their life, is the explanation for why the first Dark Matter mission failed. And over the course of the story, the partner could learn to shed some of that immaturity, to realize that protecting a life worth living requires more commitment and effort than they previously thought. The problem then is that Super doesn't effectively utilize the partner character to further the persuasive goal of the text. When the game says the partner needed to learn a different method to defeat dark matter, it's unclear when and where and how this actually took place. What lesson did the partner learn that led to accepting dark matter? Furthermore, can we find a single character in Super's cast who refuses to accept negativity and to face their problems head-on? Can we find a single sub-story which directly or indirectly deals with these issues? In my opinion, we cannot. And so we see that Super is too much conclusion, not enough evidence. We can't follow the story's dramatic logic. It is considerations like this that speak to the core of the evil Snowflake principle. The most emotionally resonant arguments in stories are the ones that show their work. Guess our math teachers were onto something after all.